But there were other differences between the rescuers and the non-rescuers that do appear to be related to socialization and to personality differences. One of the socialization differences involved how they had been disciplined by their parents. The parents of the rescuers were more caring individuals who were much less likely to use physical punishment to control the behavior of their children. Instead, the rescuers' parents reasoned with their children and explained what the children had done wrong and what kinds of behaviors were expected of them. As you may recall from Chapter 6, Martin Hoffman called this induction or other-oriented discipline and proposed that it is more likely to produce helpful prosocial children. Another difference involving the parents was that rescuers were much more likely to identify strongly with a parent who was very moral and provided a model of moral conduct. This relationship was also found by London, 1970, in his study of other rescuers, and is consistent with the results of studies of other groups of heroic altruists. For example, David Rosenhan, 1970, reported that white Americans who made great sacrifices to help African Americans in their struggle for civil rights in the 1960s also had parents who served as strong role models of moral conduct. The remaining differences between the rescuers and non-rescuers more directly involved personality traits. Two of these would be predicted from knowledge of how a situation can change the emotions and thoughts of potential helpers, and how these changes can affect the likelihood that bystanders will intervene. See Chapters 3 and 4. For example, as we noted earlier in this chapter and in Chapter 4, Daniel Batson, 1991, found that if people are made to empathize with someone in distress, the likelihood that they will help increases, even when the costs of helping are relatively high. Thus, it is not surprising to learn that the tendency to empathize with other people's feelings was greater among the rescuers than the non-rescuers. However, this was not simply the transitory kind of empathic responses discussed in Chapter 4. Rather, the rescuers were higher in dispositional empathy, a consistent tendency to respond emotionally to other people's emotional experiences and to understand their point of view. A second personality characteristic that distinguished the two groups was the willingness to accept responsibility for one's own actions and, more importantly, for the well-being of other people. This is also consistent with the finding from experiments on bystander interventions, also discussed in Chapter 4, that if something causes an increased sense of personal responsibility among bystanders, they are more likely to help. Other personality traits that differentiated rescuers and non-rescuers were more complex. One of these was labeled extensivity. Extensivity involves the combination of empathy, a sense of responsibility, and the capacity to feel concern for and attachment to other people. In particular, people high in extensivity are distinguished by unusually high levels of empathy and feelings of social responsibility toward members of groups other than their own. Although most people would reserve these feelings primarily for someone who is similar to them and part of their own group, the rescuers felt this same concern for dissimilar people who were members of other groups. Thus, although most of the non-rescuers were biased in favor of members of their group, i.e. other Christians, most of the rescuers had the same feelings for members of other groups, e.g. Jews, as they had for members of their own group. They felt that justice is not just for yourself and your own kind, but for others beyond your group. It is unusual for people to feel this way, and makes the rescuers different from most people. Finally, the rescuers were people who felt that they could control events and shape their own destinies, and perceived themselves as actors capable of making and implementing plans and willing to accept the consequences. Such people are often described as having a sense of personal control or having feelings of self-efficacy. They believe they will succeed in the things they attempt to do. This characteristic has also been found in other studies of altruists. For example, Colby and Damon, 1992, conducted in-depth interviews with 23 exceptional individuals who had made significant long-term contributions to the betterment of other people. According to Colby and Damon, One of these people's most salient traits was that they almost welcomed the challenges to achieving their goals and were unlikely to be discouraged by the obstacles that stood in the way of helping others. More recently, Midlarsky et al. 2005 conducted another comparison of rescuers with people from their countries who did not offer help to victims of the Holocaust. Their results were quite similar to those of the Oleners, that is, the rescuers scored higher on measures of empathy, social responsibility, and sense of control over their lives. Although the findings from these studies are very impressive, the research is not without its weaknesses. There is a subtle but potentially serious problem with studies that use this approach to learn about the personality characteristics of altruistic individuals. Long before they were interviewed, the rescuers had already been publicly identified and honored as heroes or true altruists. Being labeled as such by others may have affected how these people viewed themselves and formed their own self-image. This may have resulted in their answering questions from the Oleners and from others about their personality in the way they thought an altruist should. Thus, their earlier actions and the reactions of others to them, as a consequence of their prosocial actions, may have been a cause of subsequent personality differences, rather than their personalities having caused their earlier prosocial behavior. This potential problem with this approach to defining the prosocial personality means that we must continue a little further before we can draw any firm conclusions about the personality traits that are part of it. Common people, prosocial traits. In a second approach to understanding the prosocial personality, researchers have had people fill out questionnaires that measure personality traits and then examine the association between scores on the questionnaires and prosocial thoughts, feelings, and actions. Of special interest is whether the traits identified by this approach are the same as those identified by the other one. Is there a convergence of the findings from these two different research strategies? To anticipate the results of this comparison, it would appear that there is such a convergence. One key component of the prosocial personality is empathy. There have been several studies that have examined the relationship between dispositional empathy, a consistent tendency to respond emotionally to other people's emotional experiences and to understand their point of view, and helping. Most commonly, dispositional empathy has been measured with Mark Davis's 1980 Interpersonal Reactivity Index, IRI. Some of the items from Davis's index are presented in Table 7.1. Table 7.1, Sample items from Davis's IRI, reflecting individual differences in empathic concern. 1. I often have tender, concerned feelings for people less fortunate than me. 2. When I see someone being taken advantage of, I feel kind of protective toward them. 3. I would describe myself as a pretty soft-hearted person. 4. I am often quite touched by things that I see happen. Several studies have found that empathy is related to prosocial actions, particularly actions that require some planning and thought. For example, Davis, 1983, administered the IRI to students who had watched the annual Jerry Lewis Muscular Dystrophy Telethon and obtained self-reports of how much money they had donated to this charity. Davis found a significant correlation between empathy and how much students donated to the telethon. Otten et al., 1991, found that even among professional helpers, psychotherapists, those who scored high on Davis's measure of empathy were more likely to help a person with a work assignment, writing an article about psychotherapy, than were therapists who had scored low. The trait of empathy is also related to long-term commitment to help by working as a volunteer. Thus, studies of both heroes and everyday helpers suggest that people who are dispositionally more empathic are generally more helpful. A second element of the prosocial personality is a sense of responsibility. As was the case with the rescuers, a number of studies have found that a sense of responsibility for the welfare of others is associated with prosocial behavior. For example, Staub, 1974, found that participants who accepted social responsibility and engaged in other-oriented moral reasoning were likely to come to the aid of a person who was feeling ill. Berkowitz and Daniels, 1964, found that people who scored high on their measure of social responsibility were, relative to people who scored low, more likely to help someone who is dependent on them for help. The final attribute that appears to characterize both the rescuers and the lifelong altruists studied by Colby and Damon was a sense of self or personal efficacy. They were self-confident individuals who believed they could successfully meet the challenges that confronted them. Is there any evidence that this personality characteristic causes people to act prosocially? In younger age groups, children who are assertive are more likely to initiate prosocial acts than those who are not assertive. Rushton, 1984, found that people who were volunteers at a community mental health center were independent individuals who were particularly likely to believe that they controlled what happened to them. And finally, Penner and Frisch, 1993, found that helpful people are also self-assured and confident of their abilities. Measuring the prosocial personality, Penner and his associates attempted to combine these traits into a single measure of the prosocial personality. The resulting questionnaire was called the prosocial personality battery. A factor analysis of responses to the items in this battery indicates that it measures two separate dimensions of the prosocial personality. The first, called other-oriented empathy, concerns prosocial thoughts and feelings. People who score high on this dimension are able to empathize with others' feelings and thoughts, have a sense of responsibility for the welfare of others, and consider the feelings of others when they are making decisions. This dimension of the prosocial personality is very highly correlated with measures of agreeableness, and it also appears to be very similar to what the Oehleners called extensivity. Even among ordinary people, the traits that comprise other-oriented empathy appears to be related to a number of prosocial feelings and behaviors. For example, people who score high on this scale estimate the cost of helping others as lower, report more sympathy and concern for someone who is in trouble, and are more likely to help a friend with a personal problem. Bierhoff et al., 1991, found that witnesses who intervened to help victims of traffic accidents were more empathic and had a stronger sense of social responsibility than bystanders who did not intervene. Finally, Helen Hardin found that the higher someone scored on other-oriented empathy, the faster they responded in an emergency. This dimension of the prosocial personality is also related to more planful helping. People who are high on the traits that comprise other-oriented empathy are more likely than people who score low to be volunteers. In a study of volunteers at an AIDS service organization, Penner and Finkelstein, 1998, found that scores on the other-oriented empathy dimension, taken at the beginning of the study, predicted how much time male volunteers spent with people with HIV/AIDS 11 months later. Finally, other-oriented empathy has also been found to be related to how willing people were to engage in organizational citizenship behavior, OCB, especially organizational citizenship behavior that is directed at other people rather than the organization. The other dimension of the prosocial personality, identified by Penner et al., 1995, was called helpfulness and concerned a propensity to act prosocially. Interestingly, this helpfulness is not that strongly related to other-oriented empathy or to other personality attributes of prosocial people, such as agreeableness. In other words, people who are high on this dimension are inclined to perform prosocial actions, but they do not necessarily experience prosocial thoughts or feelings. Scores on the helpfulness dimension of the prosocial personality battery have been found to correlate with willingness to be an organ donor, the number of charities for which a person volunteers, organizational citizenship behavior, and willingness to serve as a mentor in a large organization. Other research has shown that scores on the helpfulness dimension are positively associated with a sense of self-efficacy, personal competence, and a need to master and control one's environment. This finding is consistent with the Graziano and Eisenberg's 1997 ideas about what constitutes altruism or prosocial behavior. It involves not only an other orientation, but also the ability to enact helping actions. Therefore, it is reasonable to expect positive correlations between altruism indices and measures of individual competence and control. Similarly, the ability to control one's emotions is associated with prosocial tendencies. Thus, People not only need to possess the inclination to act prosocially, but also to believe that they are capable of helping others. This brief review suggests that there may well be such a thing as the prosocial personality, and it is comprised of the following relatively enduring personal attributes: empathy, a sense of responsibility, concern for the welfare of others, a willingness to actually act prosocially, and a sense of confidence about the outcomes of those actions. Personality and situations. Before leaving the prosocial personality, we need to put it in context. Personality characteristics do appear to play important roles in individual differences in prosocial thoughts, feelings, and actions. The conventional wisdom of 25 years ago appears to be incorrect, but it would be just as incorrect to ignore the role of social circumstances or situations as causes of difference in producing social responses. Most importantly, as noted earlier, personality characteristics and situational factors can interact to affect people's thoughts, feelings, and actions, prosocial and otherwise. For example, personality attributes influence the decisions individuals make about places they should go and/or the people with whom they will interact. But as we saw in chapters 3 and 4, once a person is in a particular situation or with certain people, his or her actions will be greatly influenced by the characteristics of the situation and the behavior of the other people in it. Attachment styles. In the last few years, Mario Mikulinker and Philip Shaver began an interesting line of research about another source of individual differences in prosocial responses. Specifically, they explored how differences in attachment styles might affect people's willingness to respond prosocially. Briefly, attachment style refers to how a person relates to other people, especially people with whom the person has a close personal relationship. According to attachment theorists, e.g. Bowlby, 1988, people's attachment styles are the result of their experiences as infants with their parents or other caretakers. To be more precise, the crucial experiences involve how the caretaker responded when the infant was in distress and needed either physical, e.g. food, water, or emotional, e.g. comfort, safety, help. For most children, parents or other adult caretakers consistently respond to the child's distress by offering support and comfort, but other parents may respond inconsistently, sometimes being comforting and sometimes not, and still others may not respond very positively to their children's distress. According to attachment theory, these experiences lead to the formation of working models or general ideas of how other people with whom they are close will treat them. These different working models produce different styles of relating to or attaching to others. The most commonly identified styles are secure, in which people desire close relations with others and find them calming; fearful avoidant, in which the person desires intimate contact with others but it makes him or her anxious; and dismissing avoidant, in which the person does not desire a lot of contact with intimate others. Mikulinker and Shaver reasoned that people who have a secure attachment style are able to concern themselves with other people's need and welfare because they are not worried about what will happen to themselves, and because this sense of security is closely related to optimistic beliefs and feelings of self-efficacy when coping with one's own or another's distress. Such feelings would not be as strong among people with fearful or dismissive attachment styles. In some recent studies, researchers have examined how the feelings associated with different attachment styles were related to willingness to offer help. Consistent with the theoretical expectations, Gilleth et al., 2005, found that the avoidant attachment style was negatively associated with willingness to volunteer or donate blood, and that people who had an anxious style said they would volunteer primarily for selfish or egoistic reasons, e.g. to make themselves feel better. These findings are, of course, correlational, and therefore we cannot say whether the attachment styles were the cause or the effects of willingness to volunteer. In another study, Mikulinker et al., 2004, experimentally investigated the effects of attachment style on willingness to offer help to a distressed person. This experiment, conducted in both the United States and Israel, used a procedure somewhat similar to that used by Batson and other bystander intervention researchers. The participants were randomly divided into 3 groups, with members of each group receiving a different subliminal prime to activate the thoughts and feelings associated with a secure attachment style. Members of the security prime group were very briefly shown the name of someone with whom they associated strong feelings of safety and security. People in a second group were shown the name of a good friend, and those in the final group were shown the name of a more casual acquaintance. The participants then watched as another person, really a confederate of the experimenter, was asked to perform some extremely unpleasant tasks, e.g. pet a snake, let cockroaches crawl on her arm. As the tasks proceeded, the confederate became more and more uncomfortable and finally asked to take a rest. This was, of course, all staged. At this point, the experimenter approached the participants and asked how willing they would be to take the woman's place and engage in several unpleasant tasks. The results of this study are presented in Figure 7.1. About 30% of the participants who had previously received the close friend and casual acquaintance primes were willing to help, but almost 70% of those who received the secure prime were willing to help. This suggests that feelings of safety and security are associated with greater willingness to help, even when the helping involves some element of difficulty and danger. In the same study, it was also found that people who scored high on a measure of an avoidant attachment style reported less compassion for the woman and were less likely to help her. The same results were found in both the United States and Israel. This line of research is new, and it would be premature to definitively conclude that differences in attachment styles are an important source of differences in prosocial thoughts, feelings, and actions. However, this line of research certainly merits further examination, as it suggests another source of individual differences in prosocial tendencies. Figure 7.1. Participants were more willing to help a distressed person when they were primed subliminally with the name of an attachment figure, security prime, than when they were primed with the name of a close person who was not an attachment figure or with the name of an acquaintance. Okay, so the y-axis is percent of participants willing to help from 0 to 70%, and the x-axis is the three categories of security prime, close person prime, and acquaintance prime. So wow, so the security prime, almost 70% of participants were willing to help, and then for the close person and acquaintance prime, it's the same amount at 30%. Wow.